Good grief. Question everything. Why?
We are lucky to be here with Mirabai Starr today. Mirabai Starr is an award-winning author of creative nonfiction and contemporary translations of sacred literature. She taught philosophy and world religions at the University of New Mexico Taos for 20 years, and now teaches and speaks internationally on contemplative practice and inner spiritual dialogue. A certified bereavement counselor, Mirabai helps mourners harness the transformational power of loss. Her latest book, Wild Mercy, Living the Fierce and Tender Wisdom of the Women Mystics, was named one of the best of 2019 by Spirituality and Practice. Mirabai is on the 2020 Watkins list of the 100 most spiritually influential living people of the world. She lives with her extended family in the mountains of northern New Mexico. Mirabai, thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you in our presence.
I'm deeply honored. I've been tracking your work for a long time, and I've been deeply moved by what you're up to and the offering you make to this world. It's really important.
Thank you. I am so excited to have you here today. And just a little background for our listeners, 2 stories. One is the first time I met you, and that was at Parliament of the World Religions in Salt Lake City back in 2015. And I was 2 weeks out of the psych unit for depression, so I was really not in a great place. And I remember I heard you speak, and it was like a light went off inside of me, and I just had to go up and talk to you afterwards. And I think it's more than just the words you say, it's your presence. There's something deeply sacred and powerful and yet feminine and soft about it. And seeing that all at once, even in my darkness, was healing. And so to have you here today is such an honor. And the other story is some of our listeners know that we actually did a GoFundMe on this podcast for me to go to your retreat. And so thank you to those folks who helped make that happen. And that is how I got to know you better and why we're here today. So thank you to those listeners. And let's dive in, shall we?
We shall. Thanks for those stories, Aimee. That was very heartwarming.
Oh, you're so welcome. You're so welcome.
Well, and I'll just share a little bit more because it was after, I don't know if you were on a panel that Aimee went to at the Parliament, but somehow after y'all met, we saw you on the street, and Aimee was like, Mirabai Starr, like screaming across the street. And you were so like kind and patient and like excited to see Aimee, even though you had just seen her previously. And so that's my first memory of your interaction.
I played it way cooler than I was feeling. I had shades on, and I was like, Mirabai Starr, as if I actually knew you, and I'd only just met you. So then day I went to another panel, and I was like, hey, by the way, that was me yesterday. And you were like, yeah, I know.
Oh.
How did you know? Like, you meet hundreds of people. So it was very
Because Aimee, there's something about you that just completely penetrated all of the boundaries and veils that I used to protect myself, and you went straight to my heart. Whatever you saw in me, I saw in you too. It was a mutual recognition.
Well, thank you. Whew. Trying to take that in.
That doesn't happen very often. I mean, it happens all the time, and it's also a rare gift.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you. That's an honor. So let's start with the dark night of the soul, because I
yeah, sure.
Yeah, you know, let's start with some light conversation, you know. But that is what I heard you speak about when I first saw you, and that was the first book of yours I read, because Caravan of No Despair hadn't quite come out yet. So I read your translation of Dark Night of the Soul. And what I love is you bring so much complexity to this dialogue of Dark Night of the Soul, what it is, what it isn't. And I've heard people say we're having a dark night of the soul culturally right now. And I'm curious what your thoughts, first of all, if you could for those of us more secular folks, could you explain the dark night of the soul for us? And then also if the cultural idea applies, and what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, we could easily spend an hour on this, so I'm going to do my best to distill it. Thank you for the question, and it's an important one. And yes, I agree with many of the people who are suggesting that we're experiencing a kind of collective dark night or a global dark night of the soul right now. So what is that teaching? It comes from St. John of the Cross, the 16th century Spanish mystic. And it's interesting that was the first book of mine you read, was my translation of San Juan de la Cruz, St. John of the Cross's classic mystical masterpiece, Dark Night of the Soul, because it was also the first book that I ever did, and it opened the door to all the other books. It also is significant that on the day that book was released into the world, as you know, my 14-year-old daughter Jenny was killed in a car accident. So it was the first of a dozen plus books, but it was also the beginning of a deep personal plunge into radical unknowing, which is the essence of the Dark Night of the Soul. So what the Dark Night of the Soul teaching is really about is not necessarily enduring a difficult time in our lives. It's about those times, and John considers this to be a sign of spiritual maturity, when the ordinary ways we used to access a felt sense of the sacred, like for me it's chanting. I love chanting kirtan or any kind of sacred chanting, deep meditation, reading sacred scriptures in a contemplative way. There are all of these delicious kind of spiritual technologies that have been designed to evoke an experience that is sensory of the sacred, like we can feel the juiciness of our divine connection. And in a dark night of the soul, those feelings dry up. He uses the word aridity, dryness, over and over. And a deeper, darker experience of the dark night of the soul that doesn't happen to everyone, because he says most of us aren't mature enough to handle it. But I think that's just patriarchal bullshit, actually. I think it's our birthright to experience the blessing of this terrible darkness. But the deeper dark night is conceptual. So not only do we no longer have a felt sense of the sacred or access to those feelings, but we no longer can even conceive of spiritual stuff. The idea of God seems ridiculous. I guess you could call it an existential crisis. Like, what does anything mean anymore? Nothing means anything. What used to matter just doesn't. So he calls the first one the night of sense and the second one the night of spirit. So that's the overall teaching, and his message about that is when we experience these periods of sensory dryness in our spiritual lives and deconstruction conceptually, our invitation is to allow it, to be with it, to surrender and yield, and allow it to have its way with us, and allow ourselves to not know. This is the way that I see it connected to this global pandemic of the COVID-19 virus, and how so many of our structures and institutions and the ways that we've organized ourselves culturally are coming undone, and they're not propping us up anymore. And a lot of things were already fraying at the edges, and a lot of the seams were already showing. For instance, in institutionalized, organized religions. You know, the churches are no longer drawing people very much, especially millennials like you all, and there's a way in which formal religious structures are just like, they don't make any sense to a whole new generation of people who nevertheless deeply crave spiritual meaning and spiritual experience. So I think that what's happening right now is that this dismantling is being rapidly accelerated and deeply intensified by the pandemic. And so this experience that many of us have had either personally of the dark night of the soul or in small cells of community that we belong to is now spreading everywhere. and people are finding themselves questioning the very foundation of our spiritual lives, which are, of course, entwined with our lives as consumers. And we're questioning capitalism and its connection to spiritual values. And, of course, the domain of you two and so many of us who are listening to you and watching you and tracking you and learning from you, our responsibility as beings who belong to a web of interbeing, of life itself, and our responsibility to that web of life. So that's my quick encapsulation of what I perceive to be going on. And it's an ever unfolding reality for me. I have no answers, but I'm very curiously, tenderly paying attention right now.
Yes, thank you so much for that. I could listen to you talk all day. It made me think. I was raised Catholic and really fascinated by the saints and the mystics, but I'm not even sure I know how to define a mystic, except for that I want to be one.
You are one, Aimee, and I'm sure you are too, Laura. The more I get to know you, the more I suspect.
Well, thank you. So I would love to hear how you were pulled into the mystics. What and what do they have to teach us now in modern life?
Okay, that's a great question, and I think we'll begin by a quick definition of what a mystic is. So technically, in the literature of religious studies, a mystic is someone who has a direct experience of the divine, a personal, direct, intimate experience, rather than something that's mediated through accepted channels, like a priest, for instance. Like, you can only have a spiritual experience if a priest delivers it to you. So a mystical experience is a direct, intimate, personal connection with the divine that is usually characterized by love and often takes the form of lover dissolving into beloved, that there is an experience of union between the subject and the object, so that the subject-object distinction is completely obliterated in that explosion of love, or that gentle melting. It doesn't have to be dramatic. In fact, that leads me to the second part, which was the first thing you said, like, I don't really know what a mystic is, except I want to be one. I think we're all mystics. It is our birthright. It is our gift and our reality, in that often on a daily basis, we experience fleeting moments of mystical union. You know, those states where we, for a moment, forget that we are a separate self, and the whole illusion of separation from God or from our source, if you don't like the G word, goes away, and we experience our interconnectedness with all of life. And that's why we can't help, when we have those experiences of union and of connection with the web of interbeing, we cannot help but have the urge to protect it and to care for it. So our love of all creation and our grief in the face of the suffering of creation is a direct outflowing of our experiences of mystical union with all of life, and the love that arises when those moments of union happen, right? So yes, I think that that's what mysticism is. And so mystics like San Juan de la Cruz, St. John of the Cross, St. Teresa of Avila, my namesake Mirabai, who was a 16th century Bhakti, ecstatic poet from India, Rumi, Kabir, Rabia, Lala, there are all these wonderful mystic poets that I adore. They all experience this union of love with God as beloved, or with the source of all life as love itself. And they couldn't describe it analytically or discursively. That didn't make any sense. So instead there was this outpouring of poetry, which is all metaphor. It's the finger pointing at the moon, right? That gets those of us who are listening to look to where that finger is pointing, which is really the center of our own being.
Yeah, amen. Amen.
I'm thinking in these times of great uncertainty and great upheaval that many of us are looking for someone to save us, or I guess they're inviting us to look for this one person that's going to like wrap up all of our concerns and all of this uncertainty. And I'm thinking of what you said a second ago about how we're all being invited to be mystics. And I feel very similarly about we're all being invited to be leaders in this time. And I see us moving forward into new paradigms, like linking hands and moving forward together instead of having one person out front. I guess I'm trying to see how this all fits together in a way that oftentimes we're looking for leadership beyond ourselves, like abdicating our own personal responsibilities, or we're a little bit scared of our own power. I think we're scared of our own voice, and I think it's directly related to our consumeristic culture and capitalism and how we've been told we have agency over time. But I'm really moved by this idea that maybe we can all be leaders, maybe we can all be mystics, maybe we can all search for wisdom that's deep within instead of relying on this external source to come and tell us what to do or how to be in these really uncertain times.
You're singing my song, Laura.
I'm wondering do you think that comes from the hypermasculine?
Yes. Yes.
This is a question that I was really excited to ask you about, is to talk a little bit more about how we as individuals, how we as a collective can rebalance this divine masculinity with divine femininity. It seems like, for me, from my perspective, my worldview, how I'm coming to this is that maybe we're in many of these predicaments because the masculine is so egregiously outweighed or weighing too much, taking up too much space, and we've forgotten how to balance these really beautiful dynamics. And I'm wondering if you can take some time and talk a little bit more about femininity and the divine feminine, and not that all males have to be masculine and all women have to be feminine, which is something that many of us think until we can understand the complexity that within each of us there's this balance. I know you're an expert in this field, and so I'd love to just hear a little bit more about what you're thinking of this and how we can evoke more balance within our lives.
Whew. Yeah, there's so much in that complex question. And I'm not an expert in really much of anything. I inhabit lots of different spaces with curiosity and respect, I hope. But I am passionately interested in this subject, and I did write a book called Wild Mercy, Living the Fierce and Tender Wisdom of the Women Mystics, in which I really take this on, these questions, and this question of feminine leadership. So first I want to address a really important point that you made, that we all have, as Jung and many other thinkers have shown us, Marion Woodman, that we all have masculine and feminine inside of us to different degrees and in different expressions. And so when we talk about the feminine, we're speaking about and to the feminine in all beings of all genders, all people of all genders and of no gender identification, who nevertheless recognize this imbalance and wish to remedy it. And so it's going to take a long time, I think, to come to any kind of rebalancing, and it probably is going to require an overemphasis on feminine values for quite some time. And there are many men who are calling for that also. Like the Dalai Lama has been saying for at least 10 years that Western women will save the world. What he means by Western women is not that they're better or smarter or anything else, but they're the ones who have access to the resources, education and material resources, to do something to rebalance this terrible, as you say, egregious imbalance that has been perpetuated by thousands of years of patriarchy. And so, but other teachers like Thich Nhat Hanh says the next Buddha will be the Sangha. So for those of you who are not familiar with Buddhist language, the three jewels of Buddhism, or the triple gem, is taking refuge. It's the refuge vow. And you take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. To take refuge in the Buddha is to look to the life of the Buddha as an example of an awakened life. To look to the Dharma is to really study the teachings of the Buddha, the sutras, the Dharma, the teachings, the wisdom, the body of wisdom. And to take refuge in the Sangha is to gather with other practitioners on a path of awakening and service, and look to each other in some ways to guide our way. So Thich Nhat Hanh said, Buddhism has, just like Christianity, an idea of a second coming traditionally. The Christ is going to come and save us all, come again. Or in Judaism, the Messiah is coming. In Islam, it's the Mahdi. In Buddhism, it's Maitreya, this second kind of coming of the great dude that's going to fix it all for us. And I think many of us, as a Jew, I recognize that the Messiah is not a single white dude with power who's going to come and make it all okay again. It's all of us. The Messiah is a collective reality. So I think a lot of us are recognizing that right now, and you're absolutely right. The feminine has known this all along, has never for a second suspected that we're going to be saved by some singular prophetic creature. I think what you're evoking in my heart is that if we lead with feminine values of interconnection and respect for one another's voices, knowing that each of us has something special to bring to the table, then we are going to experience not only a collective awakening, but we will discover what leadership looks like in an entirely new and radically effective way. I don't think it's an accident that many of our teachers are dying right now or have died recently, like the great cultural icons of our times. Ram Dass, my beloved lifelong teacher, just died a few months ago, and he, everything that I think and teach in so many ways is influenced by him. He formulated my entire consciousness because I was with him at such a young age, in my teens, early teens. And he was a figurehead. People looked to Ram Dass for guidance and for how to do it, even though he kept denying that he was an awakened being every chance he got. I'm just a schmo doing my best. But Father Thomas Keating of the center, who offered us centering prayer and so many beautiful teachings, Reb Zalman in the Jewish tradition, there are all of these great male teachers who are leaving or who have left this world, and that wave is receding, and this new landscape is emerging that I think is going to be, and already is, much more connected and relational and horizontal, and not patriarchal and top down anymore. And that is the feminine form of leadership emerging among us. And it's a heart-based leadership, and it's an embodied leadership.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I still can't imagine what it was like to be a teenager following Ram Dass. You had a pretty wild upbringing that I think is hard for small town Michigan folks like us to relate to, in the sense that I remember reading that you babysat at Dennis Hopper's parties or something really wild like that, in addition to following Ram Dass. How did you have such a rich childhood?
That's an obscure factoid you retained there. And yes, I did. I babysat for the Hopper kids. So what happened was that in the late 60s, my parents became radicalized by the Vietnam War, and they had already been involved in the civil rights movement at that point, but they really became deeply engaged. And interestingly, considering what you guys are up to here, it was grief that truly catapulted them, I would say, into the counterculture and onto a path of alternative lifestyle. And that resulted in uprooting us from our suburban Long Island secular Jewish world. And we went on an odyssey. This was 1972. And a lot of hippie families were doing that at that point, traveling around the U.S. and Europe, and in our case, Mexico, and looking for an alternative lifestyle that wasn't driven by the norms that they'd grown up with, like the nuclear family, for instance. Even that concept felt rigid and irrelevant to my parents. And so we lived communally, and we lived in voluntary simplicity, which I would call poverty. that, they gave it all up, and we lived without running water and electricity and growing our own food and living with people and no TV and, making music. And it was that kind of lifestyle. It was the back to the land movement, all of that. We ended up, after a year of traveling, mostly living in Mexico, we ended up in the mountains of Taos, New Mexico, northern New Mexico, up in high in the Sangre de Cristos, and near Lama Foundation, where Ram Dass had created Be Here Now in community. And so that community ended up taking over the hippie free school that my siblings and I went to, the alternative school. And so we were exposed to many of the teachers who came through Lama Foundation and teachings of all spiritual traditions. It's how I got my name Mirabai. We did a musical about the story of the life of the 16th century ecstatic poet Mirabai, who was in love with Lord Krishna. And we wrote the music and the dances and the lyric, the lines to the play, and that was a huge turning point. I played Mirabai. I was the cast as Mirabai, and that was a big turning point in my life. Ram Dass gave me that name after the play. And here's another point of connection with you all, is that play that I did when I was 13. Actually, I was just 14. It was right after my 14th birthday. My first love, my first boyfriend, Philip, had just been killed in a gun accident right before we performed this play. And so my experience of really being inhabited by Mirabai had to do with the fact that my heart was broken and broken open. And maybe that's what connects most with what you two are up to, and all your listeners and your followers, is that we know that grief and loss become a portal to spiritual transformation. And especially if we can give it our assent, our consent, which is hard to do when we're heartbroken. But if we can soften into, as John of the Cross invites us with this Dark Night of the Soul teaching, if we can soften into this state of radical unknowing and allow ourselves to let down into the arms of the fire, let it have its way with us, we can emerge into a much more spacious container that it gives us the capacity to hold this impossible grief that so many of us carry through our personal losses and through our heartbreak in the face of what's happening to our mother, the earth. So it's not by using our spiritual practices to check out of our experience, to get away from our experience, right? The wonderful term spiritual bypass, but allowing ourselves, as you all so beautifully teach us, to fully show up for the experience of heartbreak, that we're able to bear the unbearable and be a source of equanimity and kindness and tenderness to others.
So beautiful, and I'm so moved by your story of your early loss in the formation. I had a loss about the same time, and I didn't have any external supports. I come from a lot of trauma and abusive parents, and I had this loss coupled against no support and sort of floundering, and I did let it harden me. I didn't open to it. I didn't have the capacity to really let it in. It was earth-shattering on so many levels, and I was left with so many questions of why has my world stopped and everyone else's keeps going? I was a seeker before that, but that really led me into seeking, why are we here? What's the meaning of life? I became a religion major in school as sort of a quest to kind of start uncovering why we're even here to begin with. And, it wasn't really until I started spending time with Aimee that I started inviting the healing process and inviting feeling back into being alive. And I wouldn't say wasted. That's the term that comes to mind. I wasted something like 6 or 7 years blocking against grief and rage and all the feelings that accompany a really heartbreaking loss. And so, I'm really new to this world of feeling and connection and trying to come back into life and come back into connection. And I think that for the last decade, I am relatively young, so I don't have a lot of time to compare it against. But, the last decade of being alive has proven that exactly what you said, right? If we allow ourselves to be transmuted by these processes that we think might kill us, if we lean into them and let them transform us, if we feel these losses, whether they're personal or collective, there's so much growth that can happen, so much perspective that can be changed. I'm so cognizant that without leaning into these feelings, without leaning into these losses, and instead putting up these walls, I don't think we can find solutions for how to navigate this really precarious planetary moment. Like, it's through being etched by that fire of grief and loss and pain that the transformation will happen. And so not just this conversation between the three of us, but like, this is our bigger invitation to lean into that fire, to really feel the transformation that's wanting to happen, so that we can go forward with new ideas of connection and meaning making that hold the hope, or at least hold my hope for what the future can look like moving forward. I've lived a life that was really blocked. I've lived a life that was purposely not met with connection, and that is not a fruitful way of living. It kills you from the inside. And the real aliveness for me has happened through facing the traumas and facing those deep losses. And I think you do a really great job of explaining it. You're very articulate in your books, in your talks, right here now in this conversation with us, that this is the task of this time, is to lean into those really painful and uncomfortable feelings, and it won't kill us. We can have the support of other people who have been through losses. We don't have to do this alone. In fact, we shouldn't do this alone.
Yeah, we can't do it alone. Oh, so beautiful, Laura. So first, I just want to say I'm so sorry for the pain that you have had to endure in your life, the terrible trauma and suffering. So that's the first thing. The other thing I want to address is that last thing, that we not only do we not have to do it alone, we cannot do it alone. We can only heal in community, I believe. And many of us feel isolated, like we don't, especially right now during this global pandemic. But community is available everywhere. I mean, the online spaces have been a beautiful example of that, although we can overdo that. And when we talk about self-care in a moment, I'll say something about that. But the other thing I want to say is that it does kill us to actually allow ourselves to surrender to grief and loss. And there is a dying that happens when we grieve deeply. And that the mystics of all traditions invite us to die that way, to die before you die, it says in the Quran, in Islam, and in many other spiritual traditions, as you know. And so it's not going to kill you in the way you're speaking of. It's going to bring life. It's going to enliven, as you said, us to be able to actually show up for the full experience, what Zorba the Greek called the full catastrophe. But there is something that dies when someone we love dies, or when some cherished structure collapses. And often we are liberated in the very process of letting go of that which we love and that to which we were so deeply attached. I wouldn't wish that on anybody, but it does seem to work that way.
Well, and what I keep thinking of is I just can't recommend your memoir, Caravan of No Despair, enough for people. And when I have a friend in deep grief or newly in deep grief, I often give them a copy, because what I love about it is you were no stranger to grief before your daughter died.
Right.
And you had been walking this spiritual path. And then you write in the memoir about how all of that fell away while grieving the death of your daughter. And the honesty in which you do that and the grit that you bring to it is healing. It's powerful. And it's what I love about you. You're small in size, but your presence is huge. It fills a room of hundreds of people at Parliament of the World Religions. I got to witness that. And the inner strength that you show up with is amazing, and it's clear when we read your memoir how it comes from deep grief, I assume. Is that fair to say, or would you say that's where your strength comes from?
Oh, thank you, Aimee, for those sweet reflections. Oh, yes. In fact, I forgot to mention when I was saying that my parents were catapulted out of our suburban little bubble through grief. Did I mention that my 10-year-old brother died? At that same.
And I'm glad you did. I was going to if you didn't bring it up.
Yeah. So, so the loss of my boyfriend Philip at 14 was definitely not my first major loss. When we left New York during that time of the anti-war movement and all that, and countercultural movement, it was also, I think, the final straw, because my parents had been kind of going on that path for a while, going down that road for a while, but what really finally uprooted us was the death of my brother, Matty. He died when he was 10 of a brain tumor. I was 7. It was a few years before we left New York, but that was the beginning of the end of any semblance of normalcy or conventionality in our lives. So yes, I have had a life that has been marked by many losses. I mean, I can't even name the number of people I've loved who have died. It's just, the list is long. But the biggest ones were definitely my brother when I was 7, my boyfriend when I was 14, and my daughter when I was 40. Yeah. So strong, I don't know about strong, but menopause helps too. Like I've gotten to this point in my life where I just won't put up with bullshit anymore. Like the things that I used to beg for, the crumbs, of recognition from perceived authority figures, for instance. I'm not wasting an iota of energy anymore wanting to be affirmed by the patriarchy. And it turns out that there are so many of us. It's younger women who are my teachers now. People like the two of you, who I am looking to guide our way, who are just this wellspring of unending insight and loving kindness and intelligence and fierce truth-telling.
Thank you, Mirabai.
Thank you so much. I heard one of your young women friends that I don't know, so I can't remember the name of who it was, said that you're like the fairy godmother for us baby contemplatives, and that's so true, because after meeting you, it does free something in us. I think the patriarchy, having someone who's lived longer under these oppressive systems, who has found her way and found her power, it empowers me. I feel safer when I'm with you. I feel braver when I'm with you. And I know that's true of the other young women I've heard speak about you as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Aimee. And I think that what I would want to convey, by the way, I love that, the fairy godmother to the baby contemplatives. That's so good. What I'd want to convey to all of you is that, and I said it before, I want to just reiterate, we each have our particular offering for the world in these times. Mine happens to be with words, writing stuff and speaking, and translating, not just literally from Spanish to English, but or Middle English to contemporary English in the case of translating Julian of Norwich's showings, Revelations of Divine Love, but translating the religious insights of the various world spiritual traditions into some kind of accessible way, English. But each of yours who are listening right now your offering is going to be completely aligned with what you love. Like, it doesn't have to hurt to be of service in this world. I don't think it's supposed to. That's a patriarchal message, that you have to go into the desert and suffer and then bring back your hard-earned vision to foist upon the world, whether they like it or not. It's, each of our prophetic task, our way of engaging in tikkun olam, the Hebrew word for mending the torn world, is going to be aligned with our joy, with what's life-giving for us. It might be making tamales. It doesn't have to look like chaining yourself to the gates of the Pentagon and pouring your own blood on draft dock or missile silos or whatever. I'm mixing a lot of activist actions there, but you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Absolutely. I feel this so strongly. like that is a fundamental truth you have just given us. And I'm going to reflect on that and have been reflecting on it. And the thing that is coming to mind when you're speaking about this is some of us, I know for Aimee and me, this is true, is we're also simultaneously trying to pursue our passions and our loves and where we can start to unweave these threads that have gotten us to these places. But oftentimes we can be really afraid of our voice as well. To take a stand on something means that we're going to elicit criticism. And sometimes that's really painful to hear, to have coming back to us. And I'd like for you to speak about that, but I also want to say that part of the problem in why many of us are afraid to take a stance, even if it's for something that we love and we think that contributes healing to the world, is because somehow we've got it in our minds that these leaders are perfect and that we need to be perfect. And if we make an error, that we don't have any room to express ourselves. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that a little bit, like this idea that we have to somehow be perfect and like further than human, like above humanity, to be able to speak out against something or to be able to follow our passions.
Yeah, such an important point. And it definitely is the conditioning that we've all received, men, women, and people of all genders, from this masculine paradigm that we've inherited that emphasizes, for instance, in all the spiritual traditions, as you well know, Laura, there's this emphasis on transcendence, like seeing this world as an illusion, the body as this impure obstacle that all needs to be transcended by virtue of our devotion and engagement in various spiritual rituals, and that this is all predicated on the illusion that we are impure, imperfect beings, and we have to earn our way into this unreal state. So the feminine invites us to fully inhabit ourselves as we are, with tenderness, with humor, with a big dash of salt. Like when you were saying, speaking out, sometimes you will elicit criticism. I certainly have with a lot of this work that I'm doing with the women's wisdom across the spiritual traditions. Not nearly as much as I actually anticipated, by the way, but some. And I've always been super sensitive. I'm the kind of person that 100 people could line up and tell me how wonderful I am. And if one person says, that I will just, that's all that I can see and feel. Like on all my Amazon review, I will look for the one review that's negative, and then I will mull that over for days. And even though often, like if you look on my Amazon reviews, like there was one for Wild Mercy, it said, I was enjoying this until she went on a political diatribe. And it's like, what does that have to do with religion and spirituality? So this book is not worth reading. Gave it 1 star. And I was like, yay, that's a great negative review. That reinforces everything I want people to know about me. Because there's no separation between the political and the spiritual. So it's this illusion that the body is this impure obstacle to be transcended and that this world is an illusion to wake up from, that all the religions, Eastern, Western, and everything in between, tell us, except maybe the indigenous traditions, who don't tell us that. That has caused so much sorrow. And I think that it's the wounded healers that are the true healers. It's the reluctant prophets whose voice we really need. The ones who say, who me? Those are the ones I trust.
Yeah.
Ooh. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And before we close out with a check-in of self-care, I also wanted to give a shout out to Patrick Hidalgo and his family. I would not have had the pleasure of knowing him without you. And he was such a gift in this world, and his sudden death is heartbreaking, and he was supposed to be a guest on this podcast.
Oh, he was.
Yeah. So while we're here together, I just wanted to say his name out loud. I was lucky enough to know him from you, and I'm very grateful for that.
Yes, thank you, Aimee. Patrick Hidalgo, who died tragically at the age of 40 just a few weeks ago. Thank you.
Thank you.
I loved him too.
In this time of great grief, especially with coronavirus, and I think that we'll see a lot more uncertainty and unpredictability and loss. And I'm wondering if you have any tools or techniques or practices that you use to prioritize your self-care as the rugs keep getting pulled out from under us? How are you caring for yourself in these times, Mirabai?
Oh, good question. And by the way, just a quick aside. So a couple of days ago, on my birthday, my friend Kate died of lung disease, and she's in Wild Mercy. So for those of you who are interested, I want to honor Kate Nilsson also today. She's in the section called "I Will Be Demeter and You Be Persephone," because Kate also lost a child. So what am I doing for self-care? Okay, it's like an imperative in my soul. It's not something I'm suggesting to myself as a nice thing to do. Right now, what I'm noticing is at the same time that I'm celebrating the extraordinary community and intimacy that's unfolding in online spaces, like it's just this wonderful experience of love and connection that I'm seeing in so many places that I've gotten to participate in. I'm also finding that I hit a wall very quickly with these virtual spaces and with the internet. And so I limit it. And I'm also at a place in my life, different people are in different life stages, where I'm getting asked constantly to do stuff. So it used to be to traveling. And since the coronavirus, it's just been a nonstop barrage of, will you speak to this group, and will you, give us some. It's that urge you were talking about, Laura, of people looking for someone to have the answers for us right now. And at first, like in the first few weeks, I was saying yes to everything. And now I'm harvesting those seeds and just trying to weed that garden. But I am saying no thank you to almost everything, and putting my energy into things that I think might actually make some difference. And even if the others seem prestigious or if they pay well, I'd rather live even more simply than I already do and not sell myself for some false sense of comfort or security right now. I am walking in, I have the great privilege of living in the edge of national forest here in Taos, but I'm walking every day with my dogs. I'm making beautiful, healthy meals with my beloved. I am sleeping more. I am reading good literary fiction, which fills my cup, and poetry, and I'm doing much longer practices than I used to do my quick drive-by morning practices, of a few sun salutations and 10 minutes of silent sitting. Now I'm luxuriating in yoga practice and meditation practice. I'm playing the flute again, a bamboo flute. I'm playing the guitar again. I'm drawing and listening to podcasts. These are things I didn't give myself a chance to do before. And I'm being gentle and kind with myself. If I just can't keep showing up, I just go away, and it's okay. And it makes everything else so much richer and deeper when I'm able to. And I know I have the privilege of making those choices right now, but I'm not using my privilege as a bludgeon to beat myself up. I'm using it as an opportunity to cultivate some space of equanimity and joy that I can offer the world going forward.
Thank God for that.
That's profound. Thank you for sharing your stories with us. Your grace and your vulnerability has been a true gift. And I'm grateful that you brought up the name of your friend that you lost and your friend, your communal friend. Mm-hmm. These people are beautiful ways that we can keep honoring them, right? If we bring them up in conversation and remind ourselves of them and create some spaces for their memory. And I'm grateful that you have taken the time, both of you, to enter in the names of people who are meaningful and who are no longer with us.
And I'm glad you connected the section in Wild Mercy with your friend who just passed away. I'm going to read that with that understanding. Thank you.
It's the Kates there. So right after the I will be Demeter and you will be Persephone, the subsection is the Kates. And she was one of the two Kates. Well, yes. And our loved ones who die, I feel really strongly, become our ancestors. And they guide our steps. No matter how wise or unwise they may have been in life, they become these wisdom beings that sustain us and show us the way when we call on them. So I really, truly believe that and live by that.
Thank you so much. Mirabai, you are an inspiration. You are a comfort and a blessing. And the fact that you would come on the show means the world to me. So thank you so much.
Oh, Aimee, you are so dear to me. And now your beloved is also. Thank you, Laura, for
It's pretty great.
pretty great, for your great wisdom and insight. And the two hearts, your two hearts are guiding us in huge ways. And thank you for that. And please just continue to do what you need to do to care for yourselves and reconnect with your joy, because we need your joy going forward.
Thank you for listening to this fruitful conversation with Mirabai Starr. We'll end with her reading a passage from her latest book, Wild Mercy, Living the Fierce and Tender Wisdom of the Women Mystics.
Modern Western culture conditions us to step away from that precipice, about love, the precipice of heartbreak, as quickly as possible. We're conditioned to see death and painful longing as problems to be solved, rather than as sacred landscapes to be revered. We are encouraged to medicate our grief, to treat loss as a malfunction that needs troubleshooting, to satisfy our longing as swiftly as possible. We may feel obliged to employ any of dozens of spiritual methods, from meditating ourselves into a trance to conjuring up the power of positive thinking in order to bypass our direct experiences. We buy into some bullshit notion of the law of attraction, which asserts that difficult life experiences are the result of faulty beliefs, and that if we simply focus on what we want, the universe will fall into place to meet our every need and grant our every wish. From this perspective, we can't help but consider loss and longing as cruel and unruly, judging ourselves to be doing something wrong when we fail to get away from the pain. Believe me, I'm not a fan of tragic loss. I hate that my beautiful, blossoming 14-year-old daughter, Jenny, crashed my car and died. It hasn't been easy to witness loved ones suffering mightily as cancer ravaged their bodies, trapping them in its clutches and not letting them go until there was nothing left of them. I am a peace activist. I vigorously oppose the culture of death that manifests in the form of war. I embrace all that is life-affirming: poetry, art, healthy food, connection with nature, community. But with this kind of messaging that pathologizes death and loss, of course many of us are going to mistake the fire of grief or longing for that which we cannot have or can no longer have, for problems to be resolved, rather than as evidence of our holy membership in the human condition and an invitation to spiritual transformation. By transformation, I do not mean transcendence, as you may have guessed by now. I mean the opposite of rising above the realities of the world. Rather, it's about becoming so fully present that the line between sacred and ordinary is obliterated, and the face of the beloved shines from every face: humans, bees, juniper trees.
We'd like to give a special thanks to Andrea Taylor, Ken Winter, Michael Rezel, Dean Lecoe, Diana Vanderdos, and Josh Swenson. Thank you for listening to Why, a Good Grief Network podcast with Amy Lewis Rowe and Laura Schmidt.
A special thank you to all of our patrons who donate money every month so that we can continue to build the Good Grief Network.
If you're interested in becoming a patron or donor, please visit our website at goodgriefnetwork.org.